Okay, thanks so much. Thanks for the incredible introduction. I don't know if I can live up to. And also thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to be in Scotland. I'm really happy to be in Stirling. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about using big data or using social media data now that we have had the Cambridge Analytica scandal and the fake news debacle. And what I'm going to do is take you through the critiques that I've developed in the last 2 years and of course before that as well, but have really come to the fore in the last couple of years with respect to doing social media research. I'll wait. And so in particular, I'm going to talk about these 7 things. Generally speaking, my research to date has rested on using social media data. So what I do is I scrape it or use APIs and repurpose this data for social research. So I'm not researching Facebook per se or Twitter per se, although I do that as well, but I'm using their data to do social and cultural research. Not so unlike, I think, a lot of the work that you're doing. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about, so I'm with you, however I'm going to critique it. So this is a meta talk. So I'm actually kind of critiquing myself, if you will. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I want to talk about the extent to which social media data, generally speaking, is considered good and the problems with it. I want to talk about the return of the human subjects. This is something that arguably started well before Cambridge Analytica. There was a sort of minor ethics turn, you could say, in about 2010 in social media research. However, it really came to the fore recently. I want to talk about the effects of using commercial data. Or data that is being collected by companies for very, very different purposes than for research. And what are the kinds of challenges that we have when thinking about the proprietary effects of the data? I want to talk about this term that I was quite instrumental in kind of pushing in the scholarly community, and this is this idea of repurposing. So not only have I argued for the repurposing of data for social research, but also the repurposing of sort of natively digital methods, so the methods that are built into search engines, recommendation systems more broadly online, to even repurpose those. And this is what I've been championing, sort of the study of the natively digital or digital methods as being quite distinctive from the importation of social, or the migration of social scientific method into web research. But now I want to critique that idea. So what's wrong with repurposing, and provide some admonitions or some ideas about how to rethink it. Recently, and I'll give you the reference at the end, I published a paper with a colleague of mine on post-API research. And it's a term that some people are starting to use, post-API, because of what is increasingly being called locked platforms. What are the research opportunities now that Facebook, starting with Facebook, but it's reverberating, it's also Twitter, are beginning to narrow the feeds and are beginning to shut down particular APIs and thereby particular research opportunities, and of course replace the data that we've been collecting independently with their own curated data sets, company curated data sets. Here, use this instead. So I want to talk a little bit about that and some alternatives. I would be remiss, I think, to talk about these sorts of things without talking a little bit about the GDPR. And I mean, I'll go through it briefly. I mean, probably you all are quite familiar with it by now. But I wanted to talk about a couple of aspects of it. So the GDPR is actually rather research friendly, and I want to talk about a couple of aspects to it with respect to collecting social media data specifically. And in particular, what we're collectively, I think, doing wrong, and what else we can do. And then finally, I mean, this is not me, but this is some other scholars talking a little bit about what is being referred to as a coming ethics, either crisis or, and it has to do with the extent to which computer science has ever been confronted with an ethics crisis before, and compared to other sciences. So I'm going to conclude happily with that. Okay, so the first point that is oftentimes made with respect to the extent to which social media data could be considered good data is the fact that the social media platforms are very, very different from research instruments. They're not like, you know, the sensors on, you know, in Hawaii and Mauna Loa that's been collecting carbon air samples for the last 40 years in the very same way. So the data is not good in the sense that you can collect it from the beginning of a phenomenon cleanly through the entire phenomenon and at the end and sort of completely. There are a number of reasons for that. You'll all be familiar with them. Social media platforms, or the web more generally, has been called unstable. Platforms have ephemeral data. The web has ephemeral data as well. Platforms too. You can think about this on a number of different levels, but one of the things that interests me is what happens when platforms update themselves. So you know probably if you make a Twitter data set that when you share it with another colleague, it first goes back to Twitter, where Twitter then looks at whether or not any tweets in your tweet collection have been suspended, deleted, etc. So Twitter cleans and updates the data before it gets sent to your colleague, before it's shared. This is because you are expected to be a good partner, but the data then becomes smaller or it becomes different. So that's quite minor. However, if you look at, for example, Facebook over time, Facebook before the like button and Facebook after the like button are very, very different, obviously. Nowadays, with the reaction buttons have of course affected like research, right? So if you want to do an over time analysis of engagement, then you would have to take into account a lot of different changes. And these changes aren't well documented. So I've had a couple of colleagues who've tried to write the history of the Facebook interface or the history of Facebook recommendations, and had the most difficult time. And because until recently, for the web archivists in the room, you know that Facebook had a robot.txt on their website for 10, 12 years, which meant that they were not allowing their archived pages, that is to say, you know, their FAQs, their policies, etc. I mean, not individual accounts; those wouldn't be archived anyway. But so Facebook was quite opaque about its past as well. So kind of trying to figure out exactly when things changed and why is quite difficult. The other thing I want to mention here is not only do the data change, but also the metrics. So you might be familiar with Jonathan Albright's quite famous work in October 2017 when he took the 6 Russian disinformation pages that were known at the time that had been operating on Facebook, looked them up in CrowdTangle, Facebook's archive, so to speak, or Facebook's sort of marketing data side, and took the engagement scores of those 6 Russian disinformation pages, Blacktivists, Heart of Texas, United Muslims of America, these sorts of pages, and found they had massive reach, far greater engagement than Zuckerberg testified 3 days before. So he published that on a public tableau, on a public data set that he visualized. The day later, Facebook changed the metrics. Called up Albright and said, we don't really agree with what you're doing. We also don't agree with how you've measured reach. He said, well, I'm using your metrics. And they went, oh. So they changed the metrics a day later. This is actually well documented. It's not this sort of just this personal conversation I've had with Albright. So this is there's instability on a number of levels. The second point is that platform rules. So these are rules that you're meant to follow. So these, in a number of ways, are not well suited for research. So, as I said before, the data becomes updated when you share it, but there are also a number of other elements to this. So you sort of enter into a partnership when you use the API. And when you do so, you agree to terms of service. Now, these terms of service are the developer terms of service, and they're kind of different from the general users terms of service. And these developer terms of service are quite interesting. So for Twitter, you're not supposed to segment an audience. I mean, this is something I do all the time. I'm interested in studying the alt-right on Twitter. So how can I study the alt-right? Well, I do this a number of ways. Normally I make a list of key players, and then I'll query them for who mentions them or who they mention, and then I create a larger network of sort of an at-mention network. Okay? So this would constitute some sort of movement of the alt-right. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate research undertaking. That's against the terms. You're not supposed to do that. And there are a bunch of these other platform rules, and we can go through a number of platforms and talk about these. The third one, and this is sort of a bit counterintuitive, or maybe not in the least bit, so it's very interesting how social media companies provide privacy tools for users. Of course, this is privacy on the front end. A lot of scholars call this social privacy. It's not privacy on the back end. It's not that. So they're still selling your data, right? But it's just privacy on the front end. What you show, how the extent to which you expose yourself, right? So this is social privacy, it's called. But the more controls that are given, of course, the more uneven the data becomes. Right? So if certain users don't want their likes to be counted, for example, or what have you, or etc., you get so the more privacy that's given, which is a good thing, however, makes the data poorer, so to speak. This is a little bit counterintuitive, but nevertheless. So these are some of the issues that people talk about when they talk about good data. The second point I want to take up concerns human subjects. It's interesting how with the Cambridge Analytica scandal in particular, we were confronted with the fact that up until recently, we were quite loose with human subject data, and I think a lot of people still are. So I think that people still don't know what to do with a tweet collection. I don't know. Maybe there's someone in this room who says I actually know what to do. But I think generally speaking, the extent to which that is human subject data and then what that means I think is something that hasn't been properly grappled with. It's because these profiles in the computer parlance are still objects, right? And they're objects in fields in databases, and this is how they're generally treated. Now, when we then subsequently begin to work with this data, oftentimes when we talk about ethics, we first talk about, I think, a lot of people, maybe not you, but me, about compliance. So we first start with compliance, and then say, well, is it true that because the data are public and the users agreed to the terms of service, then anything goes? This is a quite a popular position within certain circles in data science. I don't know, I'm looking over here, but maybe that's not true, but for many data scientists that I've worked with, that's at the next level when talking about terms of service is this extent to which we use it as a kind of cover for what we want to do. So if you look at Twitter in particular, and the user terms of service, it says again and again and again, your data is public and open to the world. It will be used for purposes of advertising. And it also says specifically academic research. So when you post, you should expect that it will be used for that, right? So if you look at the terms and actually how the terms have changed over the years, they become more and more explicit and more readable, these sorts of things. So the fact that people never read them and they're quite opaque and and full of legalese, that argument is sort of, it's true, it's still true, but people have been working on, the companies have been working on that. However, there's the third position, which has been developed by Helen Nissenbaum and others, called contextual privacy, and this is considered to be the sort of leading edge, or there's more than this. It's the ethics of care. Feminist ethics of care is also considered to be leading edge. But contextual privacy. And contextual privacy is about that the users, when sharing their data and their information in that particular context, we're not expecting or considering or thinking about that it would be used by researchers to map the climate change debate, as we do. And the question is, how do we respect contextual privacy? And how to do that. So we'll come back to that. The other interesting debate, and this is a little bit counterintuitive, but so they're human subjects anyway, right? But are they also authors? Are we citing them as opposed to using their traces? Are we citing them? And so this goes to the heart of sort of what's an author. To be granted authorial status, normally the product has to be from the sweat of one's brow. There is, in courts, there's a sort of level of what constitutes a sort of an authored product or creative output. However, sort of very, very short texts, haikus or whatever, also fall into this. And what about a tweet? What about a particularly clever tweet? So this was an issue that came up when we did some sentiment analysis on the tweets in the 3 hours, it's like around the election of Donald Trump. So like right around the time when it became known that Trump had won. Sort of like the hour before, and then during, and then 1 hour after. And so we did some sentiment analysis on those, and we found like the happiest tweet, the most joyful tweet, and the angriest. Right? And so we put them up there. And then we had the debate about whether or not this we're citing or whether or not we should ask permission and human subjects, etc. So this is also an interesting sort of avenue. Okay. A lot of my colleagues, when I'm making arguments for repurposing Facebook data, Twitter data, Instagram, Tumblr, YouTube, the rest, what they oftentimes say to me is that is commercial data. That's data that was collected for a completely different purpose, and it's also data that, if you think about its history, has become increasingly commodified over the past number of years. Twitter is an excellent example. So Twitter, which some of my colleagues call like the last vestige of Web 2.0. So they're still kind of have that slight spirit where they allow mashups and sort of how naive we were, taking data from one company and then plotting it on Google Maps and then using if then like all these sort of mashup things. So they're probably the last vestige. However, and we were talking about this yesterday with someone, I think, about what a data set now costs. So there was a tool called TextStifter, which you could very easily sort of run a query, hit return, so if you just do hashtag climate change and the keyword climate change, normally if you do the hashtag, it also gives you the keyword back. And you wanted to get that from 2006 to the present, or whatever, 2007, however far it goes back. I did this last year. This would be $54,000. Maybe that's not a lot. Maybe it is. It strikes me as quite a lot for Twitter data in the end. But nevertheless, so Twitter in particular is one of the few companies that they're selling data they're selling the data. It's one of the products, not only for marketing purposes, but for other purposes. I've been with the Association of Internet Researchers together, negotiating with Twitter to try to get academic arrangements. These go, also with Facebook and their new Social Science 1 project, which I'll criticize in a minute, is also one of these where there's questions of what data costs. The second part of proprietary effects are the archives. The archives are held by the companies, and the companies themselves update them. Right? Where Facebook are the Russian disinformation pages? They're gone. So we can reconstruct through some traces online things that had been, screenshotted or reposted. We can reconstruct part of that, but that stuff is gone. Why is it gone? Well, it might be in the public interest, but these pages broke, rules on Twitter, or on Facebook, or on Instagram. Instagram, for example, is now a sort of locked platform. So you are not able to. They ended their API in June 2016. They don't have an archive. Facebook has now committed to a political ad archive, and they have now a new API, political ad API. So if, we'll start building tools on that and see what we can do with that. But it's very, very limited. It's already been criticized. Their archive replaced 3 NGO projects, which one by the Mozilla Foundation, which were watchdog projects on Facebook. So Facebook, when they brought out their new political ad archive, they cut access to, or made it impossible for Mozilla and the other watchdogs to keep their own archives. So they also prevent others from archiving. You'll know that the first 10 years of Twitter is at the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress hasn't been able to handle it. It's too big. Talk about big data. It's too big for the library. They also don't have the funding to create query machines or the similar experiences that you would have when querying Twitter or querying Twitter's API. But because it became so big, they decided to stop. So as of January of this year, I think it is, there's no more Twitter public archive. So now they're only making special collections. So this is quite a major issue. The other thing is on proprietary effects is that researchers were considered. If you want to do your research properly, like collect data very well, you need to do things that would make you seem like a spammy user. So you need to set up multiple accounts to get around the rate limiting, to get around the limits that are set, so that you can get reasonably complete data sets if there's a particular event. So if there's a disaster, or there's an election, or there's, if there's a Brexit vote, you need to have a number of accounts running in order to get quite a decent amount of the data, or pay for it. But if you have a number of accounts running at the same time, you're not doing it properly, and you'll be cut off. You will be. You can also be banned. This can happen. So these are these proprietary effects that are quite make doing science productively quite difficult with social media data. Okay, so this is this term that is something that I've really pushed for. This idea of repurposing. And I want to now critique it. So what's interesting, this is the head of the movement of platform cooperativism, which I'll talk about in a second, Trevor Schultz. He and a number of other digital labor and other critical Marxist, neo-Marxist researchers have called the platform's intent, social media companies' intent, crowd fleecing. Of course, they have really beautiful language. So they call this what's happening data extraction, the new extraction industry, social media companies. And this is very, very different. So they're also from what science is about. So this is it's almost a sort of, it's not ethical, it's moral, some moral points. So what are you doing, relying on this sort of data extraction, this crowd fleecing for data. And what is the most critical point, and the one that really hits hard at the kind of work that I'm doing, is the second one. And that is that social media algorithms are set up to make you interact with the system. YouTube is set up so you binge watch. Right? So that's what it's about. What Facebook is about is increasing the amount of interactivity. If you are on, I don't know, even the academic software, researchgate.net, academia.edu, every time you go to one of those sites, you get an email. Have you noticed? About 15 seconds later, saying these are your weekly stats, or could you help us classify an author or something, right? They want your interactivity, they want your attention, they want your... So what they're doing is they're principally driving the consumption of social media, and that's it. So when you like, it's about social media consumption. So likes are not genuine likes. So this is the argument. I mean, it's not a sort of such a super interesting point. But when you think about it, then the entire enterprise of using social media data is called into question. The activities that are being captured are not genuine. They're not anything. They're not. What you're capturing is not action or activities in the wild. You're capturing activities in media. That's very different. I made this point before, but this is slightly different about because it has to do with repurposing. But the last one is when you're repurposing, you're being compromised, arguably, not only morally, but also in this larger apparatus that you need to set up and defend. So how do you defend these against these other points? And this is a sort of maybe a kind of discussion point as well. Okay, I want to just mention a few ideas about alternatives. And I think, generally speaking, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, maybe it's sort of slowly going away now, and people are moving back to business as usual. Maybe not. I mean, business as usual, like it's there's no longer actually. It's certainly with Facebook, a little bit with Twitter, certainly with Instagram. There's no longer business as usual. Yeah, things have changed, and we right now at the Digital Methods Initiative, we have one of our kind of flagship tools, NetViz. Like FacePager and NetAnalytic and other Facebook data extraction software, we were all invited by Facebook to reapply for access, and none of us were approved. So it's all. So right now it's sort of zombie software in the sense that it's not approved, but it's not shut off. And what's interesting is that you'll only discover that, for example, you can't get comments anymore when you're doing group analysis. Suddenly, like, oh, okay, so we better write that down for other researchers to come this way, and we better change our textbooks. And I mean, it's really affecting, business as usual, so to speak. So that's Facebook, Twitter. You will receive an email saying, the way you're currently collecting data is against our terms of service. You're like, oh, we didn't know that. We didn't know that they had changed. So this is happening now. And what is interesting is the discussion has been reopened about scraping. Now, scraping became a dirty word over the last 6 years. I mean, I don't know. The data scientists in the room, this is an interesting subject matter. What do you think? My interpretation is that it was really pushed by the social media companies. Use our API. Scraping is unethical, improper. It's slowly started to have a kind of and people will ask, are you collecting that data properly? And that what used to mean, completely, and which now means, you're using the API, right? You're not scraping. But now I think that conversation is opening up again. So if social media companies are going to lock down, is it when is scraping okay again, and what are the arguments in that favor? And it's quite interesting that there's a new book out, MIT Press, called Spotify Teardown. I can highly recommend it for people who are into this sort of thing. And there's a very strong case made in this book for alternative modes of data gathering. This was with Spotify, and Spotify tried to sue them, or they had a cease and desist letter because they did all sorts of interesting things. They created their own band, a researcher band, and uploaded songs and etc. Watched how the whole platform would work. But they also revealed that Spotify actually started as a pirated MP3 platform, which the company didn't like. Anyway, they did a bunch of these things, quite provocative, quite inventive, very creative, and which it's quite laudable, the kind of work that they did. But if you look at it through the lens of only API data gathering is proper, then it looks quite bad what they did. So now that discussion is opening up again, breaking the terms of service, and why that might be actually okay. The other discussion is about small data. It's like, now that we're in the age of big data, why are we talking about small data? And coming up with sort of robust techniques to create collections rather than and samples. Remember those two words? Rather than the big. And so how do you do that now, and how do you do that well? Digital ethnography. How is that developing? So these are some of the alternatives that people are talking about. User studies, etc. However, I want to talk about the fact that, who's left Facebook? Anyone? Okay. So, and who almost left Facebook? Okay, yeah. So if you start, so last year, you will have read in the newspaper, probably, I don't know whether it's The Guardian or somewhere else, sort of these headlines saying the top 5 alternatives to Facebook. Right? And then you're thinking, this is a sort of listicle, it's a new media format anyway. But anyway, so you get the 5, and then you've never heard of them. Diaspora, Mastodon, it's like, what are these? So you're getting this discussion, and then the other one is, well, what about our own stuff? I already mentioned ResearchGate and academia.edu. Do you know that academia.edu is owned by venture capitalists? And ResearchGate was just bought by one of the Dutch publishing, I'm being filmed, I don't want to say vultures, but houses, large ones. So these particular platforms themselves are rather kind of commodified, etc. They're not in that sense so different from the logics of the other ones. And I mean, there are some alternatives, but are we using them? Are we using, I don't know which ones in the heritage studies, but there's Scholarly Hub and there's Humanities Common. Anyway, these sorts of alternatives. There's also the idea of alternative models. This is currently being actively studied. Not as much work. So if you search Google Scholar for, like Facebook versus platform cooperativism, you'll find very few articles on this second term. But there is work on alternative models as well. Okay, I'm sort of coming to the close, but I want to talk a little bit about the GDPR. I think this is something that is now on everybody's mind in some ways in the academic community, and then you might ask yourself, well, what's the relationship of it to social media data, and what's that about? Well, I'm not going to answer that question, but I'm going to talk around it. And what I want to talk about is a couple of things. So first of all, now I want to go back to this question of Twitter, and whether a Twitter data collection is GDPR compliant. So a lot of people, like myself, have a piece of software that collects tweets, and once you set it running, it just keeps going. And so it was at one point you were interested in collecting tweets on Brexit, maybe still are, but over time, maybe that research project ended, but you keep collecting it. So that is actually not kosher. So one of the things that the GDPR is about is, in some ways, rethinking how your collection practices with social media data. And it's very conventional or traditional. So you should have, if you collect data, you should have a project, an actual project. And this project should probably have a website or some kind of documentation that has research questions and then has a duration. So this is quite interesting, because you're like, so all of these data collection of social media that are just running need to be thought about, at least if they want to make them GDPR compliant. That's one point. The second one is that the idea of consent is an interesting one in big data. So I'll just take Twitter again. So if we're collecting Twitter data, and we have 1 million tweets on, hashtag heritage or something, which maybe one of you actually has in this room. What do we do with this? So it's interesting. Twitter. So Weibo in China, you become a public figure at 10,000 followers. With Twitter, you become a public figure, at least in their recent data set release, the Russian and Iranian trolls. They hashed all users with fewer than 5,000 followers. So it's interesting. So like Twitter and Weibo, they're kind of deciding what, and according to a kind of data point, what constitutes a public figure. So this is the first step. But the second one is you have all these other tweets from non-public figures. And so you could say, okay, so the normal kind of qualitative social science rules apply. You sort of anonymize and etc. But when do you do that? Should they be should you be collecting that at all? And if you want to publish the actual account names or actual tweet content, what do you do? And then in big data, it's impractical, it is always argued, to ask for consent. So then what? So the GDPR is really interesting, and so what it says is it agrees with you. It says, yes, it can be impractical. So what you do is you post it online, and you invite people to opt out. I mean, you should, it wants you to opt in, but you can invite people to opt out. And that's one thing. Another thing is to begin to think about like consent bots, or sort of automated means by which you could ask permission or ask or invite opting out, these sorts of things. So this is one of the issues. Another one is just going to talk about another idea of publicness. And the changing ideas of publicness. So previously I talked about how some researchers think, well, the data are already public, so they can be used. And the rejoinder of saying, no, there's such thing as called contextual privacy, and users do not expect this to be used by researchers in this particular way. Some people are arguing that given the way in which people are using the settings these days, social privacy, that this is not only interesting to study, but it can be used but it can be kind of itself repurposed. So privacy settings could be part of the research. So you could say, well, these users that had this setting can appear on our map, whereas these users that didn't, etc. So this is one of the interesting points being made these days. I just want to talk about one or two things very briefly to conclude on this. One of them is the duration. So kind of data storage and future proofing and these sorts of ideas. And the new legislature of the right to be forgotten, the right to oblivion, and the extent to which this holds for database subjects. So the GDPR is quite explicit in saying that the project should have a duration, and data should be actually gotten rid of after that, and unless there's some sort of legitimate use, and this needs to be actually formulated. So if you want to keep, so when your project ends, which it's going to end in October, this particular project, and you have a Twitter data set that you collected for the project and didn't use, if you want to be GDPR compliant or you want to follow the spirit of it as well, then you should actually think about how to make it secure and actually have a kind of project associated with it, whether it's a slumbering project that has questions, duration, etc. So this is one of the. So what one does with data moving forward is something that requires attention, far more attention that we've had before. And what's interesting about it is that this doesn't apply or applies less or something to data sets in repositories that you publish. So when you publish a data set that's connected to your particular research paper, what I just said doesn't apply. So it's not this floating data set that you had for other purposes. So those should be kept. I think it's also important just in sort of passing to talk about whether or not you're using these sorts of tools, whether they're open source ones or whether they're commercial ones like Figshare or things like this, which are tools that enable you to link your data set with a particular paper and publication and actually get a DOI number for your data set. And this is it's peripheral to the GDPR discussion, but if you have that, then your data set is like tethered and considered legit, as opposed to these ones that are floating around. Okay, I just want to conclude with this sort of ominous title. So this ominous title came from an article in a newspaper in 2018, which argued that computer science, as I said at the top, has not had its kind of crisis moment as of yet. And the question was whether Cambridge Analytica was actually that moment. And the argument was that chemistry had dynamite, physics the nuclear bomb, biology eugenics, civil engineering bridge collapses, etc. I mean, I know this is quite drastic. And I don't know how comparable these like massive data breaches are, but nevertheless, there was this question of when computer science will, like these other sciences, actually have kind of like codify these sorts of ethics and things in ways that are similar to the other sciences. Not that they don't exist, norms, etc. But this was something that this was an MIT engineer saying, there's an issue within computer science, and I think the issue has something to do with this difference between ethics as a sort of foundational principle and as a principle of compliance. Right? So I've been talking now and then about to make it compliant, right? But there are particular ethical stances and practices and principles that could be underlying fundamentally, like a feminist ethics of care, which would be that could underlie the research practices more fundamentally. Now, the other radical, there's sort of the opposite position, which I also want to touch on. This is the third one, where one could say actually that these privacy settings, which I just invited us to think about repurposing, aren't privacy settings at all. So if you're a sort of an ethic, have a particular kind of ethics, foundational ethics of your project, you would probably, like a little bit more cynically, call the social media privacy settings actually the publicity settings, right? So when you're working with your settings, you're managing your publicity. It's not about privacy is the wrong word there, so sort of thinking about that people have have engaged in their ideas of what their feelings about what they want to show and what they don't want to show meaningfully. They've grappled with their privacy meaningfully. It's actually not true. But then there's the other radical position of this, which is not exactly the Mark Zuckerberg position of a few years ago, where he says, well, privacy no longer exists. But the idea that increasingly what everything is public, or everything is sort of like previous, it could be construed as like previously private, and the question here is how to kind of get back, how to sort of recreate or return to some idea of proper privacy. So what is the future of privacy? So that's it. I just want to put up these papers. So this talk is sort of written up in this article and that article, and if you want to still do digital methods, if you still want to do digital methods after this, this book came out like 2 days ago. So thank you very much.